G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm going to have a go at making a movie inside the bunk room. That's kind of cause it's the best light and sound I can come up with for the occasion. This movie is a kind of like a continuation of the Faces of Evil movie that I posted this morning. Now, I really only bought this Daily Telegraph because of the uncanny coincidence of the face on the front page being so similar to that of Gary Atin Mendham, who's the self-styled leader of the anti-natalist and the effalist movement. That's anti-A-N-T-I natalist. They're against birth. And the effalist, which is life, or live said backwards, L-I-F-E, F-ill. And he's the bloke who reckons that if he had a red button to destroy all life in the universe, he would do it in order to end all suffering. So, okay, I spotted this newspaper front page and I thought that's too amazing to not put on YouTube, so I put it on YouTube. But the problem was that it cost me $1.20 for the newspaper, so therefore I decided to, try and justify my purchase by reading the entire article, and I came across a very interesting factor, particularly in light of this much older newspaper article dating back to February the 11th, 2006, in the Weekend Australian, their health segment called Collateral Damage. Mental health problems caused by war service afflict veterans, families and children too. Vietnam legacy. Okay, so what's that got to do with Brett Peter Cowan, who murdered Daniel Morcombe? Well, I would like to suggest that Daniel Morcombe's murder is part of Australia's military history and legacy. Because apparently if you send people off to shoot at strangers because their national honour depends on it, then when they come home and they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and they go spacco, it is their children growing up in a completely dysfunctional environment who grow up to be damaged. And then they in turn do damage. So here we have an article by David Murray and Kate Kiriakou. The monster guilty of Australia's most infamous child abduction and murder is a depraved psychopath who abused up to 30 children by the time he was 18. Interesting. The victims of child sexual assault who survive grow up to have 18 times the background rate of death by suicide and 48 times the background rate of death by accidental drug overdose, and the deaths cluster 18 years after the initial abuse occurred. And by the time this fellow was 18, he'd abused up to 30 children. I wonder what his childhood was like. The Daily Telegraph can now reveal the horrific past of Brett Peter Cowan, a compulsive and habitual child sex predator, after he was yesterday found guilty of the kidnap and murder of Daniel Morcombe. The Sunshine Coast boy was 13 when he disappeared from a Sunshine Coast bus stop in 2003, a crime that shocked the nation and sparked the biggest police investigation in Queensland history. Yesterday's guilty verdict was the end of a 10-year battle for justice led by the teenagers' parents, Bruce and Denise, who fought for years to keep their son's disappearance in the public eye. Bruce and Denise Morcombe, and yes, they did indeed fight for years. I can remember when their son's face was on the front of every pizza box sold by Australia's largest fast food pizza chain, with an appeal for information for what happened and a request that anybody ring Crime Stoppers. That family conducted themselves brilliantly. The jury who convicted the former tow truck driver was not allowed to know that Cowan, and here I'll break the narrative to point out the reason the jury was not allowed to know this man's previous record of convictions is because the law requires that everybody is charged and tried only on the evidence that the police can put together regarding the case in question. There's no point the police going into court and saying, we think this person may be guilty because 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago they committed a similar crime, on the grounds that if such was allowed to occur, then any time a previously convicted individual moved anywhere, then any person who had a clean record would be able to go out and commit whatever crime they liked, in the sure and certain knowledge that the police would automatically blame whoever had a previous record. So therefore, the prosecution cannot tell the judge or the jury what the accused has previously been found guilty of until after they have been convicted, and then their record is taken into account during the sentencing. So the jury was not allowed to know that Cowan began molesting children when he was 9. So what happened in the previous 8 years? Began molesting children when he was 9, becoming more and more violent as time went on. He was jailed in Queensland and the Northern Territory for brutal sexual attacks on 2 young boys in separate incidents in the years before Daniel's disappearance. He inflicted horrific and life-threatening injuries on a young boy and left him for dead in a rusting car wreck in one of the earlier attacks. He sexually assaulted children in the lead-up to 2003 in a series of incidents not reported to police at the time. He forced a girlfriend to reenact a violent roadside kidnapping in a bizarre role play years after Daniel vanished, and he subjected girlfriends to depraved and sadistic assaults. The Telegraph can also reveal one of Cowan's former girlfriends wrote an extraordinary 6-page letter to police in November 2005, warning them that she believed he was responsible for the crime. Quote, "I know there are a lot of monsters out there like Brett," wrote Tracy Hannaveld, who was with Cowan in Darwin in 1993 when he almost killed a 6-year-old boy in a shocking attack. "But I think if he was in the area of this boy going missing, he was the one who has him or has hurt him," unquote. Cowan, 44, once diagnosed by a specialist as displaying, quote, "low-level psychopathic features," unquote. Right? So he's not really mad. He's only a little bit mad. Imagine what the really mad people are capable of. Cowan was arrested after one of the most intricate and successful undercover stings in Australian policing history, but police will face scrutiny over the Morcombe investigation after first talking to Cowan at his Sunshine Coast home just weeks after Daniel's disappearance. At the time, the convicted sex offender admitted that he drove past the abduction site at close to the precise moment Daniel was snatched. Cowan had just collected a mulcher, but his alibi came apart over the years when he changed his story and claimed that he also dropped in to see his drug dealer. Daniel was abducted from the Keel Mountain Road overpass at Wombai, next to the Sun Coast Christian Church. Cowan, who had a history of opportunistic attacks on young boys, was once a member of the church congregation, and he knew the area intimately. As my father once said on many occasions, the closer they sit to the front of the church, the closer you have to watch them. Numerous witnesses also contacted police over the years to say that Cowan was a dead ringer for sketches of the suspect in the case. Cowan was the second youngest of 4 brothers, so there's maybe a little bit of middle child syndrome in there, and had a relatively privileged upbringing as the son of an army major. And it's not possible for a 44-year-old who was born in 1970 to have a father who was a major in the Royal Australian Army unless that father was also a Vietnam veteran. So let's continue to read on about the Vietnam legacy. Growing up in Brisbane, he was sexually active by the time he was 8. What happened in the first 7 years? Who activated his sexuality? And by 10, he was abusing other children at a local swimming pool. Well, it's fairly usual for abusers who were abused as children to abuse other children who were the same age that they were when they were first abused. So by the time he's 10, he starts to abuse 6- and 7-year-olds. By the time he was an adult, he had abused between 10 and 30 children, it emerged in the 2011 inquest into Daniel's disappearance, in which Cowan was one of the key persons of interest. As a teenager, he experimented with drugs including cannabis and LSD and became involved in petty crimes such as stealing, break-and-enters and car theft. And victims of childhood abuse have 48 times the background death rate of accidental drug abuse. And this guy was into LSD as a teenager. Cowan was 18, and victims of childhood sexual abuse, their deaths cluster 18 years after the abusive incident. Cowan was 18 when he snatched a boy 7 from a childcare playgroup at Stafford in Brisbane's north and subjected him to a series of horrific sex acts in a toilet block in 1987. While staying at a Northern Territory caravan park in 1993, Cowan offered to help a 6-year-old boy find his sister. Cowan took the boy into bushland and viciously sexually assaulted him on a car wreck and then left him for dead. The boy wandered into a petrol station covered in blood and had such horrendous injuries that detectives thought he would die. The boy, who had burst blood vessels in his eyes, that generally happens from shaking, was found to have a collapsed and punctured lung and a severe injury caused by the sex attack. Well, I can understand the severe injury caused to a 7-year-old boy by being sexually assaulted, but short of a savage beating, how does he get a punctured and collapsed lung? Despite his previous similar attack, he was given just a 7-year jail sentence with eligibility for parole after 3 years, which saw him freed in time to abduct and murder Daniel. Okay, so now let's read the older newspaper article. It's been nearly 40 years since Paul Wilds was conscripted to serve with 103 Signal Squadron at Nui Dat, Vietnam. And although marriage, a child and a lifetime lie between his tour of duty as a young soldier and the man he is today, the nightmares still come. Can you get that both in there? Maybe, perhaps. Now 61, Wilds avoids crowds because he can't mix with people. Increasing outbursts of uncontrollable anger forced him to seek treatment, and he now relies on medication to check his bouts of anger. Quiet and reserved, like most veterans, he doesn't like to talk about the war, but he's making an exception today because there's a nagging doubt in the back of his mind that Vietnam could be the reason he now has a son with bipolar disorder. And they have a photograph of the son with the bipolar disorder. Wilde's 34-year-old son, also Paul, has not worked for nearly 4 years. His medical cocktail of 13 tablets a day makes him tired and listless, and mildly stressful situations spiral him into anxiety. Wilds Jr. is one of a disturbingly high number of Vietnam veterans' children suffering from mental illness. Sons and daughters of Vietnam veterans are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than those of similar age in the general population. Bracket, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics, Year 2000, Suicide in Vietnam Veterans' Children, Supplementary Report Number 1, close bracket. They are also more likely to die of accidental death, experience depression and abuse alcohol or other drugs. Since these alarming figures were discovered by accident during a 1998 Department of Veterans Affairs study into the health of Vietnam veterans, bracket, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare Statistics 1998, Morbidity of Vietnam Veterans Volume 1, close bracket, momentum has been building for a wider investigation into the mental and physical health of their children. A government-funded feasibility study recommending that this should be done is about to land on the desk of the then new Veterans Affairs Minister Bruce Bilson, because this is an 8-year-old article. But there's worry in the veteran community that recent ministerial reshuffle and potential ramifications of such a large-scale health study could see the project delayed, dumped or buried. Quote, "There is something wrong with our children," says Wild's wife Maureen. "It breaks my heart as a wife that my husband was sent off to that filthy war that wrecked his life, and now he has to watch his son going downhill. This study just has to go ahead. There is enough evidence to show there is a problem," unquote. This was back when Johnny Howard was the Prime Minister. Yes? Kind of hard to hold that one-handed. Academics are also in favour of more research and have joined the veteran community in its calls for action. In 2002, a lobby group called COVVHS, Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Study, was set up to push for the case for a big picture research. The group now says it's crunch time and will soon meet Bruce Bilson to agitate for funding. Quote, "He is going to get the message that we are not going to go away," says founding member Sue Parker. Quote, "If they don't fund a proper health study, I will be very upset if every veteran in Australia does not get up in arms and march on Canberra." Parker and her husband Jeff, who returned from Vietnam in 1969, have 2 children, one with a serious bowel condition and the other with a mental illness. She says if the politicians are worried about compensation claims, they needn't be. Quote, "That is not where we are coming from. Rather," she says, "it's about getting early medical help for those children young enough to benefit, and identifying who they are so we know who to target for assistance," unquote. Newly appointed Veterans Affairs Minister Bruce Bilson is no stranger to the cause. His electorate of Dunkley in Victoria has a large veteran community and is well aware of the issue. By all accounts, he is well liked and respected by many veterans, but he now faces the challenge of following through on this goodwill from the position of a new minister with budget constraints. Quote, "This is a very important matter, but it is early days and I resist the temptation to make any grand pronouncements," unquote, Bilson says. "Our starting position is," continued next page, "our position is that we recognise that children of Vietnam veterans do experience higher rates of some illness and disease than the wider population. The government has a pretty good record in responding to the concerns of Vietnam veterans and their families, and I am keen to see what the feasibility study identifies." Bilson says he has marked the issue a priority with the Department of Veterans Affairs. If he does give the green light to funding a full-scale epidemiological study, it won't come cheap and is likely to take 3 to 5 years. According to Professor Hedley Peach, conducting research into veterans' sons and daughters is vital not only to examine in detail the reasons behind their poor health, but to set up support services that work for them. He is also eager for doctors to consider war service when treating patients, as in many cases it could help diagnosis. See box. That would be this box. Vietnam Legacy. Children of Vietnam veterans are 3 times more likely to commit suicide, plus 1.2 times more likely to die from illness, 1.8 times more likely to die by accident. Of the Vietnam veterans themselves, 30% report experiencing panic attacks, 31% report suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, 41% report anxiety disorders, 45% report depression, about 30% report a problem with alcohol, 30% report their partners suffer from stress, anxiety and depression. And according to the American Department of Veterans Affairs, military veterans only have twice the background suicide rate of normal society members, whereas their children have 3 times the background suicide rate, because while the veteran may suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder caused by combat, they may have also grown up in a happy, stable family, whereas the Vietnam veteran or the combat veteran's child, who has a PTSD-affected parent, they grow up in a war zone. Peach, a member of a scientific committee advising the government on the feasibility study, and a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, says the government should also consider studying the grandchildren of Vietnam veterans to avoid more problems spiralling down through the generations. Quote, if the sons and daughters have got mental health problems and have young children themselves, what effect will that have on the grandchildren? We have to break the cycle. He suggests stressful familial environments could be behind the children's mental health problems, already highlighted by existing research. While many people with mental illness have a genetic predisposition to their condition, veterans were screened for mental illness before they went into the service, making stress a more likely factor in the children's ill health. So if you had a genetic predisposition for being stressed out and mad, they wouldn't have let you in the army. So if you turn out to be stressed out and mad afterwards, it's probably not a genetic predisposition, it's what happened to you while you were in the service of your national honour, shooting strangers for pay. In studies done by clinical psychologists running PTSD clinics for Vietnam veterans' children have reported a high level of dysfunction in families, unquote, he says, quote, when we focused on Agent Orange so much in the past, we missed the bigger picture. We are seeing the same sorts of problems in veterans of the Iraq and Gulf Wars, and fighters in World War II are now saying they suffered from the same problems. It is not due to any specific war, it is the generic effect of combat, unquote. The Australian Gulf War Veterans Health Study, conducted in 2003 by researchers at Monash University, supports this view. The research found that Gulf War veterans had a greater risk of PTSD, other anxiety disorders, depression and substance abuse compared to a comparison group, similar problems to those found in Vietnam veterans. This means wide ramifications for the results of a study finding conclusive links between war service and the health of veterans' offspring. The government could be looking at a major overhaul of the way it deals with returning soldiers. This is why people such as Anthony Marinac have their doubts the study will get off the ground. The son of a Vietnam veteran, Marinac has never suffered ill health but became, quote, pissed off, unquote, when he learned that sons and daughters of veterans were killing themselves. He has since written a book exploring their experiences. Quote, if you look at the history of relations between the Vietnam veterans and the government has often taken an approach of minimising its potential liability, he says. The government can get off scot-free if they like. The question is whether this is the right thing to do. I suspect they are struggling with this. Unless they are prepared to do what the outcomes of the research suggest, it is much easier to stop people from asking the questions rather than saying, why won't you provide the answer? Unquote. Marinac says research needs to be done now, not only to put the question to rest, but because the children of veterans are ageing. Leaving it too late will lose the opportunity to gather meaningful information. Although the study would be a costly exercise, he suggests there would be potential savings to the health system if this group at risk of mental illness was identified and treated appropriately and early. Wouldn't that have been nice? If somebody had have said, when this kid was 9 years old and started sexually abusing, hey, well, we should treat him because his father is a major in the army and a Vietnam veteran, and therefore the kid has grown up head fucked. Acting National President of the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia, Ron Coxon, is more optimistic that the government will come to the party, given that through the health system, it is already funding the problems of many of these children. Yeah, and they're funding some pretty large policing issue costs as well. While some of them may be using health services, most don't avail themselves of the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service, expanded to include sons and daughters following the emergence of the suicide statistics. Headley Peach says only 2% of children, bracket, there are an estimated 120,000 Vietnam veterans' children, use the service, and the government needs to investigate why. Quote, if we are going to get involved in military activities as a country, either in a peacekeeping role or whatever, we've got to realise that the impact of sending young people to war is not just going to be on the person who goes to war. Peach says, we should be thinking of providing services for the entire family for life. This is something Paul Wilds would dearly love to see. Quote, I would like to see my son's condition treated properly and acknowledged, and that he will be looked after if Maureen and I suddenly drop off the end. Unquote, he says. Though tired of fighting, Wilds says this battle is one that needs to be fought. His wife Maureen is even more adamant. I will go to my grave fighting for this, not only for my son, but for the other children. That child died because a Vietnam veteran's child grew up to be a psychopathic killer. And they say they're going to go to their graves fighting for appropriate treatment for their child and for all the other children of veterans. And without their saying so, they're actually going to be fighting for the safety and the rights of the child victims. Of the people who were called up to serve in the Vietnam War. Join the army, get your head shot off. Join the army, get your kids fucked up. Join the army, get a Darwin Award. Because this little Royal Australian Army Major's son, he's going to die in jail. Because he kills people for sexual thrills. Daniel Morcombe was murdered for Australia's military legacy. That is what the statistics show. That is what the history shows. And if you don't want to accept that, well, I'm sorry for you. But you're not living in the real world. This is the real world. Join the army, get your kids fucked up. Go and talk to some veterans. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.